Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our presentation today. My name is Dr. Ilaria Bertoletti, and I am the director of Gallaudet's PhD in Educational Neuroscience program, or PEN program here at Gallaudet. Before we start, I wanted to share a few housekeeping details with you. We will have the opportunity for people to post comments in the chat. The goal of the chat is for individuals to connect with one another around the content. But for any formal questions for our speaker, please use the Q&A box, and we will hold all questions until the end of the talk. If you have any problems seeing who's on the screen, please use the chat and we will try to troubleshoot to make sure that everybody can see all those who are on the screen. Also, before we get started, I do wanted to share some sad news. Our next presenter has canceled her talk. That means that today is our last speaker for this year. But we are lucky to have a great presenter and we're looking forward to hearing her speak. I'll now turn it over to Christina Kim, who will formally introduce our speaker. Welcome to the Gallaudet University PhD in Educational Neuroscience Distinguished Lecture Series. This lecture series aims to honor world-renowned scientists in the field of psychology, education, cognitive science, and neuroscience. These different fields, and all of the interdisciplinary fields in between, contribute to the new and growing field of educational neuroscience. They increase our understanding of the human mind and the neural mechanisms of learning. This year's Distinguished Lecture Series theme is exploring the foundations of human development and consciousness. I am honored to introduce our distinguished lecturer today, Dr. Catherine Hartley. Dr. Hartley is an associate professor in psychology. Her academic career began at Stanford University, where she received a BS in symbolic systems and continued her PhD in psychology at New York University. She then did her postdoctoral training as an assistant professor at Sackler Institute for Developmental Psychobiology. And then came back to NYU, where she is today. Have you ever wondered how children, adolescents, and adults behave differently in high-risk, high-reward situations? Dr. Hartley's research examines how dynamic changes in brain circuits lead to these flexible functions. Dr. Hartley and her team investigate the adaptive benefits of how individuals learn and make decisions at different developmental stages. In doing so, they hope to understand how specific learning and decision-making biases contribute to psychological vulnerability or resilience. Her work has been supported by the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Mental Health and Drug Abuse. Dr. Hartley's research excellence has also been recognized with early career awards from the National Academy of Sciences, the Association for Psychological Sciences, the Society for Neuroeconomics, the Cognitive Neuroscience Society, and the Social Affective Neuroscience Society. Today's presentation is entitled Causes and Consequences of Exploration Across Development. And now please join me in welcoming Dr. Catherine Hartley. Dr. Hartley, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'll share my screen. Thank you for the invitation to join today and for the kind introduction. I'm excited to share with you some relatively recent line of research in my lab. And it's a fun line of work to talk about because in many ways it's quite different than the majority of work we do in my lab, where we use controlled experiments to study learning, memory, and decision making and how they change over the course of development. Today, I'm going to focus on an aspect of how we learn and make decisions that shapes what we remember. And I'm going to, which is exploration. And I'm going to examine aspects of how exploration unfolds outside of the lab in the real world. So I like this video because I think it captures so compellingly how from the earliest stages of development, we're avid explorers. We engage with novel, unfamiliar, uncertain stimuli in our environments. And through this exploration, we, even if it may not be goal-directed, it serves an important adaptive function. Through exploration, we can learn about the structure of our environments, about the affordances for our actions in the environment. And this knowledge is information we can carry forward to shape our subsequent behavior. So this exploration doesn't stop in infancy or in early childhood. Because we live in complex environments, our daily activities are constantly bringing us into contact with novel experiences or uncertain situations. And while it's clear that the nature of how we explore exhibits qualitative changes over the course of development, it's not understood, it's not well understood what drives these changes. What governs developmental changes in exploration, and what are the benefits of exploration at different stages of development? So today I'm going to talk about some work that addresses these questions. And in most of my work, as I said before, we're studying these questions in the lab. And this line of research that I'll present today really represents my first attempt to try and understand whether these insights that have been gleaned about exploration from laboratory studies actually generalize such that we can see these same principles in real world behavior. So today I'm going to tell you about studies that are demonstrating principles that we already know have been observed in laboratory research. So I'll tell you that exploration is experienced as subjectively rewarding. I'll tell you that exploratory behavior systematically changes over the course of development. I'll tell you about a controlled laboratory study that explores what cognitive determinants of exploration are changing with age. And then I'll present to you just a high-level overview of some ongoing directions where we're taking these real-world research directions in ongoing and future work. Okay, so exploration being subjectively rewarding. So I live in Brooklyn, and if I walk outside of my house, I will see townhouses around that look like this. On a typical weekday, I get on the subway and I come into my office at NYU. If I decide that instead of eating at my desk like I do most days, I go sit in Washington Square Park. Unfortunately, even though we're in the early stages of spring, our trees don't yet look this glorious, but imagine I might see a beautiful blooming tree. And if instead of taking the subway home again at the end of the day, I hop on a city bike and ride through town and over the Brooklyn Bridge, I might see different sights and sounds than I saw on my morning commute. And the central idea in this first line of research that I'll tell you about today is that the diverse and novel experiences that we have as we explore our environments more broadly are beneficial for our emotional well-being. So the notion that experiential diversity promotes well-being is quite well supported from experimental laboratory research. In particular, studies of the effects of environmental enrichment have shown that when animals are reared in environments where they have the opportunity to encounter novelty, to explore, to interact with conspecifics, and to learn, that these animals exhibit a range of behavioral differences that are consistent with the idea that they have better well-being. They play more, they're more likely to approach and interact with with conspecifics, with other animals. When they encounter uncertain situations that could be good or bad, they have optimistic evaluative biases and are more likely to engage. And they show resilience to subsequent stress. And all of these behavioral profiles are consistent with human behaviors that are indicative of greater well-being. We also know that rearing animals in an enriched environment changes their brains. There are a number of brain regions that exhibit changes in their structure and function in response to environmental enrichment. And these include regions of the brain that are important in learning and memory, but also regions of the brain that are important in reward processing. And it's been proposed that increased exposure to novelty may underpin the affective benefits of experiential diversity. So novelty is known to have subjectively rewarding and reinforcing properties. Novel stimuli make us more likely to repeat the actions that led to their occurrence. Novel stimuli elicit activity in reward-sensitive brain circuits. And they promote a preference for the contexts in which we encounter novelty. And we know a little bit about the brain circuit that may support the ability for novelty to function as a reward. The hippocampus, a region of the brain that plays an important role in forming long-term memories, is also sensitive to when we encounter new information that we haven't encountered before. Oh, excuse me. The hippocampus, when novelty is experienced, sends signals input to the ventral striatum. This ventral striatal loop engages the activity of reward-sensitive dopamine neurons. And it's thought that through the engagement of these connections, novel stimuli are able to be experienced as subjectively rewarding. So we live in extremely complex environments that afford seemingly limitless opportunities to encounter novelty, but the degree to which we encounter novelty may depend on how broadly we explore our environments. And this work was really inspired by a study that I read in 2013, in which many mice were reared in a large enriched environment. It had many levels, different regions of the environment. This is showing its sort of bare skeleton, but there were different bedding materials, other social interaction partners, running wheels, food sources, all within the environment, such that if animals explored, they had the opportunity to discover new things. Every animal within the environment had an RFID antenna attached to it, or a transponder attached to it. And throughout the environment, these red rings are RFID antennas that could sense where the animal was within the spatial enclosure. And so these animals' movements, position could be tracked over many, many days within the enclosure. And the researchers computed a measure that they referred to as roaming entropy. Here on the left is an example of a low roaming entropy day, where an animal is spending most of its time in this yellow region up in the corner, and spends a little bit of time in a couple other places. Here is a high roaming entropy day on the right, where the animal is spending more extensive periods of time in a much greater extent of the enclosure. And what was found was that animals that tended to have higher entropy days also showed higher levels of new cell formation, neurogenesis, within the hippocampus. They also exhibited the signatures of well-being and improved learning and memory that are consistent with past studies of environmental enrichment. And so I read this paper and I thought, we all carry around in our pockets all day devices that are capable of continuous geolocation tracking. Would we see that as humans move about our environments on a day-to-day basis, that the level of the degree to which we have novel and diverse experiences brought about through high or low roaming entropy, does this govern our sense of well-being and our positive affect? So we asked this question. I worked with my collaborator, Erin Heller, at the University of Miami to do this study. And we carried out this study in participants in both New York City, a city where perhaps people move around in somewhat atypical ways compared to many other American cities, as well as in Miami. So we brought 132 participants into the lab, young adult participants. We configured a GPS tracking app on their phone and tracked them continuously for the next 3 to 4 months. Every other day, we sent them a text message and asked them to complete a survey, giving us measures of their positive and negative affect. They had to rate 5 positive affect terms. How happy do you feel? How energetic do you feel, etc. And 5 negative affect terms. How sluggish do you feel? How irritated do you feel, etc. So every other day we get these measures. We calculated for each day a measure of their daily roaming entropy. Roaming entropy is calculating the distribution of each minute, the minutes of a participant's day across spatial locations. So the maximal roaming entropy would be if a person spent each minute of every day in a different location. And the minimal roaming entropy would be if a person spent all minutes of the day in a single location. We found that roaming entropy for our participants varied from day to day. So here I'm showing you a low entropy day and a high entropy day from the same participant. On a low entropy day, they spent a large chunk of time in a single location. It looks like they made maybe 1 excursion and walked back to that location. On a high entropy day, they're covering a lot of ground and visiting many other destinations. This is a low and high entropy day for a participant in Miami. You can see on the low entropy day that the bulk of time is spent in 2 locations, perhaps home and work. And you can see that on the high entropy day, they make many other excursions to additional locations. Okay. So do individuals feel better on high roaming entropy days? The answer is yes. We found that these fluctuations were predictive of day-to-day fluctuations in positive affect, such that on high roaming entropy days, participants reported feeling more positively. This was only true for positive affect, not for their negative affect rating terms. I should note that this effect holds when we control for many other variables that might have affected either their movement patterns, whether this was a good day for going outside and moving around, or their affect, things like the city, the day of the week, the survey time of day, the temperature, was it raining, was it snowing? Controlling for all of these variables, we still see that greater roaming entropy predicted greater positive affect. So we had hypotheses about the underlying brain mechanisms that might underpin this effect. And so we brought participants into the lab at the end of this recording period, as many as we could, and we got about half the sample, just under half the sample to come back. And we had them do a 15-minute resting state scan where they just lay in the scanner. They're allowed to let their minds wander. And during the resting state, there are regions of the brain that exhibit synchrony in their spontaneous fluctuations. And this degree of synchrony has been interpreted as a reflection to some degree of the strength of the coupling of these regions, the effectiveness of their information exchange. And so with this data, we wanted to know, could we see evidence for the engagement of the hippocampal striatal circuit that I told you about previously? So we defined a seed region shown here in yellow, which is within the ventral striatum. It's a region called the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is sensitive, its activity is sensitive to positive affective states. It is responsive to the receipt or anticipation of reward, and it's responsive to perceptual novelty in encountered stimuli. And so we asked the question, where in the brain is the degree of correlation between activity in the nucleus accumbens and a given brain region related to the strength of the entropy positive affect effect? I'll say this another way. Is there a region in the brain where stronger coupling with the ventral striatum predicts a greater influence of roaming entropy on positive affect? And we found a region in right posterior hippocampus where stronger correlation with activity in the nucleus accumbens was associated with a greater influence of roaming entropy on positive affect. So this is an individual differences effect. And I should note that this is consistent with previous studies that have shown that stronger structural connectivity using diffusion imaging between the nucleus accumbens and the hippocampus is associated with greater novelty-seeking traits in a publication about 10 years prior. Okay, so you may be thinking, you've told me that roaming entropy predicts positive affect, but you've also been throwing around the term novelty. You haven't showed me any data about novelty. It could be that on a high entropy day, someone visits 100 locations, and on another high entropy day, they visit the exact same 100 locations, and there's no novelty at all across these days, no difference in increase in novelty. So we wanted to address this question, and what we did was we took every location that each participant visited in the first 10 days that we were recording their data set, their data, and we held that out. We reasoned they're likely to have spent time in their home, spent time at their office, the places that are part of their daily routines. Then, starting on day 11, every GPS latitude and longitude coordinate that we had in our sample, if it did not already appear on that participant's list, we counted it as a novel location. And so for each day, we derived a metric of number of novel locations visited. This number of daily novel locations was correlated with roaming entropy, but not perfectly correlated. And we found that the effect of environmental novelty of number of novel locations visited each day had an even greater effect on positive affect than the effect of roaming entropy. Now, you may also be thinking, what about experiential diversity? Maybe participants that are walking around Lower Manhattan see one coffee shop after another, one fancy shop after another, boutique. Maybe these aren't really diverse experiences. How could we demonstrate that experiential diversity is really driving these effects? So we thought long and hard about this, and reviewers really encouraged us that if we were using these terms, we needed to substantiate them. And we realized we could use metadata associated with locations to characterize what they were like. So let me explain what we did here. We pulled data from the US Census Bureau that's linked to specific locations, smaller than a zip code, but bigger than a latitude and longitude coordinate. These are called block groups that are units, areas of space that encompass 500 reporting households. Okay, and within those block groups, statistics were reported like the population density, the total number of businesses, the mean level of unemployment, the median age, race, and gender, how educated the people who live in that block group are. So we got social and demographic features of these locations that were within our sample. We used a principal components analysis to try and reduce the dimensionality of these data down to their fundamental dimensions of covariation. And 3 principal components accounted for about 85% of the variance in these measures. And then we median split these principal components so that every location was coded as a location that was high or low in principal component 1, high or low in principal component 2, and high or low in principal component 3. So now every location in New York and in Miami is coded as being one of 8 places in this 2 by 2 by 2 space. And you can see, as I previewed, that indeed huge chunks of lower Manhattan are being treated here like one single location. And so then we asked, does entropy in this 8 location sociodemographic feature space predict positive affect? And the answer was yes. Greater diversity in the sociodemographic features of the environment each day was associated with greater positive affect and even more strongly than the effect of roaming entropy. You may also be wondering, what's the causal direction of the relationship? So I've told you a story, and this was very much our hypothesized direction, that when we encounter novelty, we feel better, we feel more positively, but it could be that when we feel happier, we're also more likely to explore our environments. And so we exploited the time series nature, the longitudinal nature of our data, and we said, does yesterday's novelty and diversity predict today's positive affect, controlling for the same day relation? And does yesterday's positive affect predict today's novelty and diversity? And the answer was yes. Both effects were significant, controlling for the same day relation. And this suggests, this is consistent with theoretical models that have proposed that positive emotion and exploration have this sort of feedback cycle. This is Barbara Fredrickson's broaden and build model. And she proposes that positive emotions drive us to broaden our activities, engage in novel thoughts, explore novel social relationships, that this builds our personal resources, our knowledge, our social support, makes us more healthy, and produces more positive emotion that leads to a positive feedback or an upward spiral. And while our bidirectional relationship is consistent with this, of course, it can't just go up and up and up, or we'd all be wandering around blissfully in our environments. There must be some return to baseline that's happening, but we do see evidence for this sort of feedback dynamic. Okay, so I've told you so far that daily diversity in our physical locations that we experience through exploration bring us in contact with novel and diverse experiences that promote positive affect. Individual differences in the strength of this effect are associated with the degree of functional coupling between the hippocampus and the striatum, regions that are implicated in both novelty and reward processing. And this relationship between entropy and affect is likely bidirectional. So next, we wanted to explore whether we could see evidence that real-world exploration changes over the course of development. And we had strong hypotheses that it should. So it's been proposed that the balance between exploration and exploitation here, which would be doing things we've done before and we already know we like to do, that this balance shifts over the course of the lifespan from childhood to adulthood. And it's been proposed that this shift may be adaptive. When we're younger, we have a long time to live. And so being more, having a stronger propensity to explore our environments may promote learning. about the structure of our environments that is advantageous, that we can exploit at later time points to make better decisions. There's also evidence across species that younger individuals of those species are more exploratory. So here, this is a caracara raptor, and both juvenile and adult animals were given the opportunity to engage with either simple or complex novel objects. And for both the simple and complex objects, we see that more of the juveniles approached and engaged with these objects than the adults. We see this as well in two non-human primate species, the juveniles being more willing to engage with novel objects than the adults of the species. There's also evidence that exploration may be uniquely tuned during adolescence. So this apparatus here, this contraption, is called an elevated plus maze. It's shaped like a plus, and it's lifted up on legs, so it's up in the air. And the animal is placed in the center, and many mice prefer to remain in the closed arms. And this is often used as a measure to index anxiety-like behaviors, their latency to or willingness to explore the open arms. And here we see that adults are spending most of their time, and juveniles, in the open arms, but in the closed arms, but adolescents are more willing to explore these open arms. Okay. Exploration during adolescence may also serve a unique or adaptive function. So adolescence is a developmental stage that has been associated with greater reward sensitivity and exploration, as well as novelty seeking. And these propensities may be important, as this is also a stage where individuals need to achieve independence from their parents and caregivers. And this exploration may support their ability to meet and affiliate with peers. And it may also give them the ability to start learning how to make autonomous decisions in new contexts. Okay, so we wanted to test many of these ideas, and we brought teens and adults into the lab. The sample is, I believe, age 12 to 27. And we had them complete self-report measures of real-world risk-taking, 2 questionnaires. We had them give us information about their social network size, the number of individuals that they interacted with in the last month, and we gave them a way of recalling this information. And for 3 months, we tracked their movements using GPS, and every other day we had them indicate their levels of positive and negative affect. We hypothesized that we might see 2 things. First, that adolescents might exhibit higher levels of exploration, that their mean roaming entropy each day might be higher. We also hypothesized that adolescents might find exploration more rewarding, that their positive affect might be even more sensitive to fluctuations in roaming entropy than adults. So first, we did see evidence that mean roaming entropy changed with age. Here, we see an increase throughout the teenage years in mean roaming entropy, but we're seeing a peak in this sample. And I think we should cautiously interpret this as a peak. I don't think we can be confident that exploration is going down in these adult years. Our sample is not large enough to draw those conclusions. It may be that it reaches something more like an asymptotic level. But we see increases across adolescents that are peaking around early 20s, later than we had actually hypothesized, and I'll come back to that later. We did not, however, see any evidence, while both our adolescents and adults reported higher positive affect on days where they had higher roaming entropy, we saw no difference in these slopes as a function of age. And I'll show you here, these are the slopes plotted against age. And there is decidedly no difference with age in the extent to which exploration is boosting positive affect. If we look at participants' social network sizes, we see that for both adolescents and adults, those individuals that explore more, they explore their environments more, also reported having more social interaction partners. They have larger social networks. We also found that uniquely for adolescents, those who explored their environments more also reported higher levels of real-world risk-taking. This was not true for our adults. And I'll tell you that one way we're interpreting this finding is that it may be that when adolescents explore, when minors under the age of 18 are exploring, they're likely doing so with greater parental independence, these high exploring teens. And they may be more likely to encounter for the first time situations where these risk-taking behaviors can be expressed. These surveys ask questions like taking physical risks, doing dangerous things, experimenting with drugs or alcohol, experimenting with sex. And it may be that these individuals who have more parental independence are able to explore these behaviors at an earlier stage, and so are reporting greater risk-taking. But in our 18 and older adults, by this stage, it may be that these situations are no longer novel and unfamiliar situations. They're situations in which each of these adults has a policy for how they behave in those situations. And so the degree of exploration is no longer coupled to the propensity to engage in these risky behaviors. Okay, this is something we're interested in exploring further in future research. Okay, so here we found that mean levels of roaming entropy increased across adolescents. And we're really interested in the idea that why we might be seeing a peak around age 20 is that this is after we've granted legal adulthood, this cultural milestone, to teens. They leave their parents' house. They're allowed to drive themselves around, to explore their environments more freely. And it may be that at this age, we're releasing these social and cultural constraints on exploration that may be present for the younger teenagers that are living mostly in their parents' homes. And just to give some data and support for the social and cultural modulation of exploration, these are data recorded in children in the Hadza tribe. This is a nomadic people that live in northern Tanzania, and they recorded the movement behavior of these kids. So on this top panel here is a daily movement trace of an 8-year-old boy and girl, and here a 13-year-old boy and girl. And what you can see here, these are plots of the length, the range size, the furthest distance traveled. You see around age 11 that these measures associated with exploration start to increase first in boys, and then by age 13, you're seeing comparable levels of exploratory movement in both boys and girls. But I'll note that this is at we're seeing this increase at an extremely young age. And so it may be that the cultural factors are constraining when and how much teens are allowed to express their drive to explore. Okay, we found that daily exploration was associated with fluctuations in positive affect for both adolescents and adults in an age-invariant manner, and that higher levels of mean roaming entropy were associated with larger social networks for all participants, but greater risk-taking selectively amongst the adolescents. And we speculate that this adolescent-specific effect may be due to increased exposure in adolescence for new types of, for decision contexts that are new types of experiences for these adolescents. Okay. We have a confound here, though. I've just told you that maybe adolescents are engaging in risky behavior because these novel contexts are uncertain. Novelty also brings us in contact with perceptually novel situations, places we've never seen before. And is it this novelty, this perceptual novelty, or this uncertainty about what the right things are to do in this environment that drive exploratory behavior? It's very difficult to disentangle these two variables, novelty and uncertainty, in real world contexts, because places that are new are also places where we may have some degree of uncertainty about how to behave in those situations. And so in this next laboratory study, I'll show you about an attempt that we made to try and decouple and deconfound the influence of these variables on exploration. Okay, so how did we do this? We brought children, teens, and adults into the lab, and we had them make a set of reward-guided choices. And this was work led by a graduate student and a postdoc in my lab, shown here. So on each trial, participants saw 2 hiding places, and they're told you're exploring these magical regions. In each region, there is a magical creature, here the purple wizard, that has hidden gold coins in their favorite hiding place. You're more likely to find coins if you find the hiding places that they like best. On every choice, you choose between 2 hiding places, each of which is associated with a fixed probability of finding a gold coin. In each block, participants had 15 trials to choose, and they saw 3 hiding places. So importantly, after 15 trials, they'd transition to a new block. And in that new block, 2 of the hiding places were images that they had seen before in previous realms, and 1 was novel. But importantly, we can dissociate the influence of perceptual novelty of this new stimulus from value uncertainty, because in each new realm, the favorite hiding place of the creature that lives there will be different. And so the value of each of these cues is equally uncertain at the start of each block, but they differ in perceptual novelty. Okay, so what did we find? We quantified value, uncertainty, and novelty as a function of either the number of wins and losses, the variance in the wins and losses, and novelty was inversely related to the number of times you'd seen that stimulus before. And we could look at the influence of each of these factors on choice. So here I'm plotting the influence of the value difference between the option on the left and the option on the right. And what we see, this is a psychometric function, is that children, adolescents, and adults are more likely to choose the thing on the right if the thing on the right has higher value, and more likely to choose the option on the left if the option on the left has higher value. So next I'm going to plot how their choices are modulated by novelty. And if individuals are novelty seeking, then the blue curve would sit to the left of the yellow curve. And that is indeed the case. So here, for 2 options that have equivalent value differences, if one stimulus is more novel, it's more likely to be chosen. And this was true for children, teens, and adults. If we next look at uncertainty, however, we see that whereas compared to children, adults are more likely to avoid options that have greater value uncertainty. And we can plot this, so this is both replicating prior findings in adults, but we can plot this continuously as a function of age. And here we can see more clearly there's no difference in the novelty seeking behavior that participants are exhibiting. They seem to value novelty, but with increasing age, individuals are avoiding uncertain options to a greater degree. And those of you who are very astute may be wondering, are kids really more willing to engage with uncertain stimuli, or is it simply that they're not even computing their level of uncertainty? And so they might be at chance because they're ignoring uncertainty. They're not paying attention to uncertainty at all. And we were concerned that that might be the case, but we can see here that children, adolescents, and adults all take longer to make choices for options that have greater uncertainty, suggesting that they're processing value uncertainty, but they're not exhibiting uncertainty aversion. Okay, so here we saw no evidence of a developmental change in the influence of novelty on reward-guided choice. And this suggests that heightened exploratory choices early in development may be driven by a greater willingness to engage with uncertain options at younger ages. And we remain interested in thinking about what additional factors might drive adolescent-specific exploratory behavior, but it may be that the released constraints that adolescents have on their roaming behavior, combined with a drive toward exploring and reducing uncertainty and being driven to seek out novelty, that these drives may produce this sort of age-related gradual increase across adolescence without any adolescent-specific drive influencing this behavior. Okay, so next I'm going to tell you, I've given you an example of how we can use both laboratory studies and studies of real-world behavior to explore these questions. Next, I'm going to tell you about some ongoing research that's really building upon this work. So first, the first additional study is looking at the influence of daily novelty exposure on memory. So the hippocampus is a region that is not only involved in novelty processing, but plays a critical role in long-term memory formation. So as I said before, it's interconnected with the reward system. And it's been proposed that the influence of spatial novelty may engage, may trigger dopamine release, reducing the threshold for learning in the hippocampus. And it's been proposed that novelty shifts the brain from a memory retrieval mode to a memory encoding mode, promoting the retention of the information encountered in these novel contexts. And so we wanted to know whether we could find evidence that real-world novelty produces this effect. And in our study, we're collecting both controlled measures of recognition memory that I'll tell you about in a moment, and autobiographical memory. We were also interested in knowing whether there are age differences in the effect of novelty on memory. So we're currently conducting a study. We have 42 participants so far, spanning the age range of 10 to 25, with a target sample size of 120. We're completing this study all online, so participants don't have to come into the lab, but they are configuring on their phone a GPS app. And over the next 3 months, while we're tracking their movements, twice a week, we're asking them to rate their mood and to do a memory task that I'll tell you about in a moment. And once a week, we're asking them to recall all of the events of the previous day. So in this memory task, we'll ping them with a text message in the middle of the day and say, hey, when you have a minute, do this task. And once they start it, they'll see a series of 20 images. And we say, just tell us whether this image is old, new, or similar. And here, if they saw a stream of images, this red umbrella, if they saw this on day one, would be old when they see it again on a subsequent day. Whereas this black loafer shoe here would be similar. It's not the exact one that they might have seen on a previous day, but it's similar. And having these similar lures enables us to test the specificity of memory as well. So I'll quickly show you just some preliminary results. We're still collecting data, but we do see some evidence that's consistent with our hypothesis. So here what I'm showing you is the main effect that's present in the data, which is that we're testing memory at a 1 to an 8-day interval between each successive test. And what we're seeing here is that things that were studied more recently are better remembered than things that were studied a long time ago. This is just forgetting. We don't see a main effect here or we don't see that novelty at encoding is directly altering this forgetting curve. However, we see that novelty at retrieval is modulating the slope of forgetting, such that if people are asked to do the memory test on a high novelty day, they're less likely to remember things that they encountered many, many days ago. We also see an interaction effect, however, with novelty at the day of encoding, such that items that were encoded on low novelty days and retrieved on high novelty days are very difficult to remember, this light line in blue. But items that were encoded on high novelty days and are being retrieved on high novelty days are protected from this flushing effect when the brain shifts from a retrieval to an encoding mode. That's how we're interpreting these preliminary findings. Okay. I'll tell you about one more study where our data analysis is still in progress. Here we were interested in understanding whether exploration might predict the success with which adolescents kind of navigate life transitions. And we were particularly interested in when teens might transition to a new school, either going to a new high school or going to college. And so we recruited 13 and 14-year-olds and NYU freshmen. The college students, we recruited them the day that they were moving into their dorm rooms and being dropped off at college by their parents. And we tracked all of the high school students in the week before they were starting at their new high school. And we tracked all of them continuously for the next 3 to 4 months. We had them complete mental health questionnaires. Every other day, we had them rate their positive and negative affect, and we asked them, did you meet any new friends in person today that you added to your phone or to a social media app as a direct contact? Every 2 weeks, we had them complete brief measures indexing their anxiety and depression levels because we were interested in how roaming entropy might relate to mental health. So first, we replicate that the university students have a higher degree of roaming entropy than the high schoolers, consistent with this idea that independence is associated with greater exploration. We see that these participants are reporting higher levels of positive affect on days where they have higher levels of roaming entropy. And we see that on days where they have higher roaming entropy, they add more individuals to their social network. They make friends. Strikingly, if we look at the relationship between roaming entropy and positive affect, we see that it's modulated by participants' anxiety levels. In low anxiety periods, roaming entropy is associated with positive affect, but in for high anxiety individuals or high anxiety periods, roaming entropy is not associated with greater positive affect. In fact, there's a trend towards a reduction in positive affect, suggesting that they're no longer finding this exploration to be subjectively rewarding. And we're interested in our ongoing analyses in examining whether this may drive subsequent reductions in roaming entropy that contribute to the emergence of depression. We know that one of the core symptoms of depression is inactivity, which may feed depression in a cyclical way, a sort of downward spiral, by preventing the encounter with the types of rewarding experiences people might have in the real world. We're also interested in quantifying the degree of routineness that emerges in these college students' behavior as they're living in a new city to understand whether a balance between novelty and structure and routine are associated with better mental health for college students. Okay, so I've given you a taste of what this research program looks like. I'm excited to hear your questions, and I just want to first acknowledge the many people who have been involved in doing this work. These were members of my lab who led these studies, and my collaborator. And these are the members of my current lab who have given great input into how we've analyzed this data that you've just seen. I also want to thank my funding sources and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hartley, for your presentation. Maybe while we're waiting for people to type in their questions, we can have you close the slide. That would make all of us easier to see.
Yes.
An amazing presentation. I mean, yeah, again, really novel for me, very far from my line of research, but very interesting and just led me to do a lot of thinking. And again, maybe while people are still thinking about their questions, trying to figure out what to ask or typing out their questions, I can open up the discussion with a few questions of my own.
Sure.
I was just thinking about how you showed that higher exploration and that behavior was correlated with more positive affect.
Mm-hmm.
And just thinking about the world that we live in today, more and more people are working from home.
Mm-hmm.
Just wondering, how do you see research or the research that you're doing translate into, this real hot topic about working from home? And currently there's a lot of controversy around it, whether or not it's good, whether or not people should go back to work. Just wondering, what do you think your research tells us about that topic?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, of course, if someone is spending a greater proportion of their day, if you're sleeping at home and you're working at home, this is going to limit the perceptual novelty you experience in your day-to-day life, the number of social interactions that you're having, and I think it is a reasonable worry that this kind of constriction of the experiences that a person is having in their day-to-day life could have negative repercussions for well-being and mental health based on a host of research, even in controlled laboratory studies, suggesting the benefits of social contact, of changes in context and novelty. Yeah. One thing I will note is that we actually, the first paper I told you about was published in 2020. We actually began the data collection for that, I believe, in 2015. It took a long time to make its way out. But my collaborator, Erin Heller, was geolocation tracking a set of participants in 2019 and the transition into 2020 when we went into COVID lockdown. And so he had the opportunity for these University of Miami college students to see their entropy affect dynamics when they were out in the world before the lockdowns, and their entropy affect dynamics after their roaming was substantially restricted, like all of us, when we were spending more time at home. Now, this was a very unusual natural experiment, obviously. So what happened? Positive affect levels went to the floor, negative affect levels went to the ceiling, and roaming entropy went down. But as people spent days and weeks mostly at home, they would start to go out for a walk and enjoy being outside for the first time that day. And what he found is that the relationship between entropy and affect, which again, in the data that I showed you in all of these studies, this is all relative to an individual's given baseline. So a higher entropy day for me makes me feel more positively, a lower entropy day may make me feel less positively. And what he found is that these baselines reset, but the positive slope resumed, that people began to experience more positive affect at much lower absolute roaming entropy levels, but the slope was restored. And so I imagine that for people who work from home, there is this kind of constriction of the novel experiences that they're experiencing, but that the doses of novelty that they're getting as they go out at the end of their workday, as they maybe go for a run in the morning before they start their workday, that these may be they may retain the power to have these beneficial effects on well-being and maybe also on learning and memory. It doesn't seem like we don't see evidence for an absolute amount of novelty. Where we see mean levels of novelty coming into play is something like social network size, which makes sense. If you're out in the world more, absolutely, you might have a bigger social network. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Also, of course, that makes sense, right? That people will, fit in with their environment and they'll become more used to what's going on in their everyday life. And like you said, humans will know what they're able to do to be able to change how they process the situation that they find themselves in.
Mm-hmm.
So it's good to know that, if we're staying home to work, that we can still adapt to our environment and still be positive with whatever our environment gives us.
Mm-hmm.
I also forgot to tell people that if anybody feels more comfortable signing their question in ASL instead of typing it in English, please do let me know in the chat and I can promote that person to panelist and turn on their camera if they'd like. Let's see, I just see somebody adding a comment to the chat and asked if anybody can see the Q&A. And if the Q&A is open, I think it should be, but let me just check on that.
It says no open questions. Yeah.
All right, so there is one person that wants to ask their question in ASL, so I will invite Joseph, can't spell today, up on the screen.
Hi.
So sorry, my finger spelling today is terrible.
No worries at all. Thank you so much, Dr. Hartley, for your really beautiful presentation today. I am so curious about your participants at New York University, New York being a large city, and you mentioned people potentially having bidirectional influences from that feeling of positivity to where the socialization and the exchange between each other occurs. How do you apply that to, let's say, for example, people who grow up in rural areas or suburban areas or places where societal expectations are a bit more dormant than explorative?
Yeah. I am really interested in understanding the extent to which these effects generalize to other types of locations. New York and Miami are both relatively urban locations where there is, perhaps a lot of ability to experience sociodemographic diversity and other types of perceptual novelty that might exist in the environment. More residential neighborhoods versus more neighborhoods where there are big office buildings or things like that. You can imagine if you're living in aspects of rural America where it's miles and miles and miles of farmland, and you're situated within this as your local ecosystem, it might be that there's a less absolute level of perceptual novelty or experiential diversity that's available to you through exploring your environment. So we're really interested in seeing the extent to which these effects generalize. It may be that there are other dimensions of novelty that could be, we imagine a child growing up in a rural neighborhood by the farm. It may be that, they play in the field, they go over to the stream, they, that they're like, to the extent that they're a little, there's a local variability in the kinds of activities that the environment affords, that gets magnified in their sort of daily repertoire, and, the degree to which they're learning about, you can think about the scale of this kind of novelty and diversity. Okay, if you're growing up, it may be that geolocation captures the kind of novelty that kids are experiencing in those kinds of environments much more poorly, because what a kid on a growing up in a in a farm in a rural environment may be doing is sitting on the ground and looking at the ladybug that's crawling across their, or studying that, like looking much more locally in a way that this geolocation measure that we're tracking is about at the resolution of one New York City block. And that we kept it at that resolution for an obvious reason. We wanted to be able to resolve changes in location in a dense urban environment. But it may be that the way in which exploration and learning are playing out in day-to-day movements in these environments that have different, like afford different kinds of exploration, are fundamentally different and less tied to location. A question I often get with this is, okay, I'm sitting in my office. I can sit in my office and meet new people like I have today. I could sit in my office and watch someone else present a lecture to me and tell me new information that I've never heard about before. I could sit in my office and read a novel that is entirely new and maybe exposing me to ideas I've never thought about before. So we can have many novel experiences that are independent of location. What we're capturing with these GPS measures are just like location associated dimensions of novelty. And it may be that those dimensions are less important in environments where there isn't a high degree of heterogeneity in the experiences that you might have if you were to roam. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
We do now have 2 questions in the chat.
Yeah.
One I think is more technical. So I'm going to try to sign the question.
Sure.
This person asks, I'm just wondering if you have taken the workshop for Landmark.
I haven't. Yeah. I don't know much about it. Yeah.
And then the other one. And I think this question relates with the question that Joe asked. They said, similarly, I'm thinking about people who live in small towns or suburbs instead of cities. I'm wondering if television or social media or other online resources can function as a stand-in as exploration of novel experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we know from controlled studies in the laboratory that novelty, hearing new music, seeing stimulus that's perceptually novel, that these sorts of multisensory, multimodality experiences, if they're new, they're preferred. And so we can, again, as I said before, we can have many types of novel experiences in a manner that's location independent. I would imagine that these kinds of novelty are similarly experienced as rewarding, and that in our daily lives, people may be titrating their exposure to novelty in many ways. The things that I'm reading, the people I'm interacting with, the books that I'm, my TV shows, my social media, and all of these ecosystems that afford novelty exposure may be providing the same types of beneficial effects that we see when people experience variability in their locations. There's some work that has looked at web browsing exploratory behavior and how people jump from topic to topic. And there's some preference for introducing novelty when people sort of saturate with exploring a given topic and want to move on. So I think you can observe this in many different types of behaviors. And yes, I think in people that live in places or even have constraints on their time or mobility in certain ways that prevent them from reflecting these exploratory drives in their movement patterns are probably seeking out novelty in other ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just wanted to tie in a question with your response.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just thinking about situations or contexts where a person is sitting at home, maybe watching TV all day, and that TV show may provide a lot of novel information, but I still feel like at the end of the day, that person won't really feel a lot of positive affect. Now, maybe if they're involved with a more social type of online experience, maybe virtual reality, where they're interacting with others. For example, now video gaming can be a huge opportunity for people to online interact while they're playing the video game, and that might provide a more positive or rewarding experience versus a person that is just sitting watching television, because that is less interactive compared to a gaming situation which is more interactive. And so I'm wondering if those two would show a different result.
Yeah, I think there's good evidence. So in addition to novelty driving the reward system, another dimension of our experience that can engage the reward system is agency. Am I actively playing a role in the choices that I'm making or the exploration that the things I'm seeing, and when we walk around in the world, we're agents exploring our environment. When we watch television, we're much more passive. We have a choice in what we watch, but the new things we're seeing are not meaningfully tied to our lives in some way. Of course, gaming can be done in a social environment, but gaming even has a higher degree of agency. Your actions are making things happen in the game. And I do think that these different dimensions of cognitive reward, if you will, may compound and lead to an experience that is even more engaging. That has, we know, for example, that people learn better. I've done work that's shown this is true in children as well. Individuals learn better when the information they encounter is a consequence of choices they've made, even inconsequential choices. If I pick to turn over this card and you show me the picture on the other side, I'm more likely to remember it than if you just flipped it over and showed me, even though the outcome was the same. So agency seems to matter. That the experiences we have result from our choices matters. And so I think in exploration, we're seeing both agency and novelty kind of coupled together in terms of their benefits for well-being and probably also their benefits for learning and memory. Yeah.
Thank you. There are a few more questions in the chat, so we'll move to the next question.
It looks like one we've addressed.
Right, another person does ask about
yeah,
if that study is happening now in rural areas.
Yeah, we have not actually launched a study in rural areas, but we're very excited to conduct this kind of research at a bigger scale. We are planning for the submission of an NIH grant to explore, to explore some of these questions. Yeah.
All right, and then we have another question. This person says, I grew up in a suburban environment, but then went to college for my undergraduate experience in a very, very rural area. They said in the initial period, I did feel like I wasn't seeing much.
Mm.
But with time, I felt like I was paying more attention to the world and had that reset. So I was more aware of these smaller or minor environmental changes as I moved through the world.
Yeah, I I think there are interesting intuitions here. So the same way that I was saying, in a rural environment, where maybe there isn't a lot of apparent variation in the things that you're seeing, or in the diversity of experiences that you might have in those places. Um, as you note, um, that diversity depends on the kind of extent of your attention. Um, uh, and, you know, in often in an urban environment, we're tracking people's locations with their cell phones in their bags or their pockets or in their hands. Um, and so people are walking around in these environments, where, there may be buildings and signs and restaurants and shops and trees and parks and flowers but if you're walking around and you're looking down at your phone, or if you're listening to a podcast and you're deep in this story, how much are you processing the degree of experiential diversity around you? There's another element in your question, which is maybe something related to like habituation, that we kind of adapt to some degree to, and I think this may have to do with the sociodemographic experiential diversity. We may adapt to the block to block, like even if it's a suburban neighborhood and not an urban neighborhood, it's, more houses, more lawns, more buildings, more cars, and it may be when there's a big change in the look and feel and energy of a place that happens. If you remember those maps, like if all of lower Manhattan is like one neighborhood, it may be that, when you go out to Queens and everything is much less vertical and more spread out, and oh, these houses have front yards instead of walking into an apartment building and walking up the stairs, that it's those things that are associated with sociodemographic variability that really like harness your attention. So yeah, we're really, I don't know that we have the right measurements in our data for these college students. One, we don't have good data on where they moved from. And that would be a really interesting thing to study, how like the types of transitions and the nature of the environment might influence their propensity to explore. Maybe it might also influence aspects of their like anxiety levels. If you're moving from a place that's very different to a city that's more dense, or then the habituation that needs to to what a new place is like might be more intense than if you are moving from a very similar type of place. So these changes, these differences, might be more or less salient to you as a function of what you're already familiar with. Yeah.
Just to make sure there are no other questions in the chat. Oh, I do see that Dr. Pizzi does want to come up and ask a question on screen.
Okay.
So if you would turn on your camera. Sure, I wasn't sure if we had enough time.
We do. Yeah, we've got a few more minutes. Go for it.
Great. So this is just a little bit speculative of a question, but I'm wondering, I've just, been thinking about the research that you're doing about novel experiences, about exploration, and just thinking about how that ties into creativity and curiosity.
Yeah.
especially within an environment like a classroom and a classroom learning situation.
Yeah. So there have been a handful of studies that have studied different aspects of, well, curiosity and how it's processed in the brain that suggest that states of curiosity, um, when that curiosity is satiated, when you find out the thing you want to know, you see very strong reward signals. So again, curiosity seems to be a drive that is a need to reduce uncertainty about this thing or something like that. I think the two are likely closely related. You know, if we think about the drive to explore perceptually novel things, you can almost imagine curiosity. You know, let's imagine you're that raptor bird and you're seeing these weird novel objects you've never seen, all anthropomorphized, but it might be something like, huh, what is that? I don't know what that is. I don't understand how it would work. What could it do? And you approach it. And so I think that curiosity states may play a role in novelty seeking, both in, and I think it's the uncertainty reducing properties of the behavior that probably are accompanied by an experience that is something like curiosity. And I think, you know, we know that if you, I'm thinking of a study that used a sort of trivia-like framing where participants in the study were asked a question, you know, some fact they don't know, might be about like a star and how, you know, how it works, or, you know, astrophysics, or the capital of a city, or the, you know, and they were asked a set of questions. They were asked to rate how curious they were to know the answer. This varied from question to question across individuals. And then they got told the answers. And then they were quizzed later for how well they remembered things. And what predicted their memory was how curious they were. So there's some degree of like, I want to know this. And it may be that there's some idiosyncratic drive for a participant in that study or for a student in a classroom that governs their curiosity, their drive to need to gain that information. But that is an important predictor of long-term learning. And so I do think that understanding how to engage these intrinsic motivation processes that put the brain in a state where it's better able to encode long-term memories is really, it has really important educational implications. You know, obviously, I've barely touched upon anything like learning in a, you know, teaching context or in a classroom context. Our memory study does suggest that for totally irrelevant, incidentally encountered information, we're seeing some modulation of memory by the dynamics of novelty that are happening in the real world. But understanding that, one, how you can construct these situations in a setting like a classroom, and how real world experiences are really creating a context for a given learner that may be different from student to student. I think understanding both of those things is going to be important for like translating this kind of research into didactic kind of learning contexts.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. I had a similar question, but you've already responded. I was going to ask about how curiosity relates to, your research and the idea of novelty exploration, but you've already answered that. And I was just thinking about, for me, often if, a question pops up and while I'm going about my daily business, I feel like I need to pull up my phone immediately
Yes.
and satiate my curiosity. And sometimes I'm frustrated if I have this burning question and I don't know the answer to it. But we don't have much time now, but I was just thinking about the relationship between novelty and positive affect. And just thinking about older people who have potential limited mobility or are staying at home, how could we consider replacing their entropy with VR or an age appropriate gaming or a way that people could still interact with the world or still have agency regardless of their limited movement?
We know that one of the most effective ways of combating cognitive decline beyond exercise, which is probably number one, is engaging in sort of new learning opportunities. And this has both cognitive and emotional benefits for older people. And so if movement is constrained, I think, engaging in these types of learning experiences, which could be studying a new language, listening to a audiobook, your point about agency is well taken. I think for some of these activities to have some degree of kind of active engagement or learning or processing is probably important. But I think probably now more than ever, it's possible to make use of, if someone wanted to learn a new skill or to, you can get on YouTube, you can watch videos for how to do a certain thing. You can, within your own home, begin to, learn a skill, take a course. I think the internet has been very democratizing in providing access to learning opportunities, and so I would imagine that what preserves well-being in individuals who whose ability to physically explore their environments may be compromised are the kind of engaging in the kinds of activities that allow for agency, encountering novelty, and achieving some learning progress. I mean, we talked about the curiosity and the uncertainty reduction being important, but learning involves those, a cycle of wanting to know, finding out, kind of scaffolding knowledge iteratively. So I think engaging in those sorts of learning opportunities is probably very important.
Thank you so much. Our time is up. Again, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Just enjoyed your talk very much, and it's a great topic for educational neuroscience, and is perfectly applicable to what we're doing here. So I wanted to thank everyone who joined us today. And we will see you next time. Again, unfortunately, our final presenter is canceled, but we look forward to having everyone back next year.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to share with you. Take care.
Have a great day, everyone.